Welcome, friends. This is Mike Williams. For those that follow my work on the Beatles conspiracy, you are probably aware of the mystery surrounding the identity of Billy's biological parents. This is a piece of the puzzle that has yet to be solved. Although some will point to Aleister Crowley as Billy's biological father, that premise remains unproven, even though the narrative in memoirs could lead the reader to come to that conclusion. But what if the Crowley angle is a dead end, and one of the fictional threads contained within the book to make the identity of Billy's parents more challenging? In this interview, Stacy, who is a Beatles researcher, puts forth a case based on other more subtle clues contained in memoirs that points the reader in a completely different direction as to who Billy's parents might be. Stacy contacted me a number of months ago and explained she believes she figured out the identity of Billy's parents. She then emailed me a summary of her findings, and I found her research to be compelling. I asked Stacy if she would be willing to present her findings, and she agreed. Her journey took her back to William Wallace, Sir William Douglas, Robert the Bruce, Sir James Douglas, and the 14th Duke of Hamilton. And so without further ado, here's Stacy. Before we get started though, Stacy, what I'd like to ask you is, how did you get started in this whole McCartney and Beatles conspiracy bit?
On YouTube, your video, Did the Beatles Write Their Own Music, popped up for me. I saw that. I knew instantly because Rubber Soul was my favorite album. There's no way they put that together in 30 days. I don't know anything about music, but I knew you were right on with that. So that's what got me started. But that's when I bought the book, and I've watched your videos ever since.
Okay. Yeah. So that video was back in April of 2020. And then you bought the book after that.
I did buy the book after that.
What did you think of the book when you started reading it? Just out of curiosity.
Well, it took me time to wrap my head around it, because at first I doubt, are they really two people? Really? And
yeah.
Over time, you see the ears and all the evidence, and yes, they're two different people. And I just really dove into the book. But you know how it is, you dive into it and then you have to walk away for a while because it's just too much.
Yeah, it can get a bit dark, right?
Dark.
Yeah. I tell the audience the same thing, that there are dark aspects of the book, and sometimes you just have to put it down and then come back to it. Now, I mentioned before we got started here, Stacy, that the book strongly alludes to Crowley possibly being Billy's father. I never said definitively that Aleister Crowley was his father, because
that's true.
The book was leaning into it, but I just could not grab onto something that I thought was hard evidence.
And I never thought that he was his father because of Barbara Bush. I don't think he's her father. Young Barbara Bush looks a lot like young Marvin Pierce. So to me, it was just to sidetrack us, or to maybe get us to revere Aleister Crowley somehow.
Whether Crowley is his biological father or not, and you're going to show us that he's not, Crowley's influence on Billy in his life, I think, is very significant.
Yes.
Yeah. So that piece of it, in my mind, is still very important. So to get started here, what clues did you find? How did you put together what you're going to show us? Because I think it's an extremely good piece of work.
Well, it started when, we were trying to figure out who the father was, which you concentrate on the Sir William chapter. That's all about William Wallace. But that didn't make sense because William Wallace left no children. And so I started concentrating on that chapter. I started looking at the people around William Wallace to see if there were any clues. And I found this Sir William Douglas, William the Hardy, which is my first big clue. Oh, the Hardy. Now, his father was named William and his son was named James. So then I got it into my head. Well, since Billy's son is named James, maybe Billy's father is also named William.
Well, in the book, it tells us about the Hardy warrior.
Right. And the thing about this William the Hardy, he was the first nobleman to join William Wallace in his fight for Scottish independence.
Okay, so what the image you're showing us here of William Douglas, is this the person we're talking about?
Yes, that's Sir William Douglas, the Hardy, and his son is named James. So after he dies, his son, he was first lieutenant to Robert the Bruce. So the story goes that when Robert the Bruce was dying, he asked the good Sir James, was his nickname, he asked him to take his heart to Jerusalem for burial. And they say that James, the good Sir James, wore Robert the Bruce's heart in a silver casket around his neck for the rest of his life. He intended to do that. It would never happen. He was killed, I think, in Spain.
Okay, so just back up a second to make sure I'm connecting dots here. So Sir James Douglas is the son of
William the Hardy.
Okay, and just to repeat what you said before, William Hardy's connection to William Wallace is...
He was the first nobleman to join William Wallace in his fight for the Scots.
Okay.
The English.
Okay, so that's the connection back to William Wallace.
Right. And then it continued with his son being the first lieutenant to Robert the Bruce.
Okay.
So with his nickname being James the Good, it makes me think of that line in the book. It's in bold. It says, "I want a good heart." And then I think of the song Heart of the Country. So after he wore that heart and a casket around his neck, and you can see it in that image there.
In the statue right by his chest area.
Yeah. And it was after that they added a heart to the arms of the Douglas family. Before that, it was just the 3 stars. So because of the good Sir James and Robert the Bruce, they added this heart. And that also makes me think of that art show he did. There were so many paintings in that art show Queen Elizabeth went to. But anytime you see an image of the Queen at that art show, they're always and only in front of this painting of a heart, back to Heart of the Country.
Right. And again, folks, for those of you that are not familiar with Billy's solo career, he has a song, Heart of the Country. I think it's off the Ram album.
And so then I'm wondering, well, what's all this about Wallace? Why is the whole chapter concentrating on Wallace? So I looked up the definition of the name meaning of Wallace, and it means foreigner or stranger. And it also says in that chapter, I was a descendant of an extremely different Sir William. It must be somebody else. And he also says in that chapter that his great-grandparents were named John and Arlene Crawford. Now, John means blessed by God. Arlene means pledge or promise. And Crawford, the English meaning is crossing of the crows, but the Gaelic meaning is crossing of the blood, which I think you can take to mean a blood oath, too. So now I see these names as really nothing more than a metaphor, some of them.
Okay.
And then I started to wonder, well, is there still a Lord Douglas? Is it still a title? Is that still a thing? And that's when I found the Lord Douglas at the time, the year of Billy's birth, was this Alfred Douglas Hamilton. And let me first explain how those names were hyphenated. So in the 1600s, the second Duke of Hamilton left only a daughter as an heir, Anne, and she married William Douglas, Lord of Selkirk, and then they became the Duke and Duchess of Hamilton, Lord Douglas Hamilton. So that's how those names got hyphenated.
Okay, so make sure I follow. So on the left is Anne Hamilton.
Yes.
She married
Lord Douglas, Earl of Selkirk. So he was from the Douglas clan because she was her father's only heir. So at that point, they just hyphenated the names, and that's how those families joined.
Okay, so on the right, we have Earl of Selkirk.
Right. And he's from the Douglas clan.
Okay.
But then he adopted that name. They hyphenated it.
So the Hamiltons and the Douglases now, they've come together.
They've come together. And I've read that it's one of the most titled families in all of the UK. Because when they joined those two families, a lot of titles came with it. Well, Alfred here, he inherited the title from his fourth cousin, William, who only left a daughter as an heir. William left his daughter most of the lands, but he left the title to his fourth cousin, Alfred, Hamilton Palace, and $1 million in debt. I would have said no thank you, but he took it. And he had been a sailor And then he was suddenly the 13th Duke of Hamilton.
Okay, so you have to excuse my slowness here. So the 13th Duke of Hamilton, which I'm looking at right now.
Yes.
How does that relate to the prior slide?
So Anne and William in the 1600s, that's when the families joined. So he's just a descendant of these two.
Okay.
That's how the names were hyphenated, and that's how he ended up. His name was Alfred Douglas Hamilton. He got the title from his fourth cousin, and his fourth cousin left him the title because his fourth cousin only left a daughter as an heir, and rather than leave the title to her and her husband, he chose to leave it to his fourth cousin, which is pretty distant relative. I mean, Alfred was just a sailor, and then suddenly he's the premier peer of Scotland.
It sounds like they didn't want to leave the title to a woman. It almost sounds like he had to seek out a male within the family bloodline.
Yes, and I mean, unlike Anne in the 1500s, William chose to keep it in the bloodline with the paternal bloodline, the male bloodline.
Okay.
But he did leave most of the land to his daughter and $1 million in debt to Alfred, which...
Yeah,
wow.
What a good guy.
Yeah. Hamilton Palace, too, which was quite a structure, but they ended up tearing it down in the early 1900s because there was coal mines underneath that compromised the structure. So even that didn't benefit him much.
So we're looking at the 13th Duke of Hamilton right now. So his tenure was 1895 to 1940. So that's the period of time when he was the 13th Duke?
Yes, and so he was the Duke when Billy was born.
Okay.
And so that's kind of why I focused on him. I just wanted to know if Lord Douglas still existed. And there it is.
When did he die? Do we know?
1940. And then his son, Douglas Hamilton, became the Duke. He became the 14th Duke of Hamilton. Okay, Alfred. He married Nina Mary Benita Poor. And that kind of gets my attention because in the book it says William was born a poor young country boy. And Tom's footnote says, well, of course William was born young. But I'm looking at this name, her maiden name, Poor, and wondering if that's a clue. So 3 years before Nina married Alfred, her brother Robert married Alfred's sister Flora. They had no children, but he got my attention because he was born in Dublin and he played cricket for South Africa, which brings up the line, have you ever noticed the pipes line sung on the Let It Be album? And I'd looked into that a long time ago. And what that is, it's John Lennon on the Let It Be album singing, Oh, Danny Boy, the old Savannah's calling.
Yeah.
Well, with Robert being born in Dublin, he's a Danny boy, plays cricket for South Africa, Savannah. But then I wonder, do pipes have anything to do with cricket? I didn't know anything about cricket. I looked up cricket and pipes, and yes, they use what they call pipes in cricket to secure the netting or the chain link fencing to create enclosures to keep the ball in a certain boundary. So pipes is a thing in cricket. And I'm thinking this is who he's talking about. So back to Nina. Nina, 2 years after she married Alfred, she co-founded the Anti-Vivisection Society. And in the dictionary, it says the only people that use that word vivisection are people that are against it. And it's people that are against the use of animals in scientific testing. She was an animal rights activist.
Okay.
And then I wonder if did that influence Billy to create a character named Viv? Because here's this woman, maybe she cares more about animals being protected from experiment than people. She also, in World War II, she used a Douglas Hamilton property called Fern House as an animal sanctuary. It was to protect the pets of wealthy Londoners during the Blitz. And you know how Wikipedia gets edited. That's how it was described when I first found this. Since then, it's been edited many times to make her sound altruistic, as if she was just getting animals off the street. But I believe the first version, it was just for wealthy London families.
Yeah, that's the thing about Wikipedia that folks have to be aware of. Whenever I look something up, Stacy, I actually save it as a PDF because I have found instances myself when I was doing the research or as I do the research where I would go back to a Wikipedia entry and I noticed that, well, the wording was changed.
It's unreliable as far as that goes, but it's good for birth dates and death dates.
Yeah, the basic information.
Yeah.
Okay, she dies January 51 at age 72.
Yes. So I'm looking around Alfred and Nina's children and grandchildren, and I still don't know if I'm looking for mother or the father. And I still had in the back of my mind, maybe Billy's father is named William. I don't find a William, but I find their grandson, James, who was born in 1942. He's on the left. He's the current Baron of Selkirk. And I'm thinking, wow, they have the same chin. Maybe they're cousins.
Yeah, you could see the resemblance. It's interesting. You should point this out. I had the image previously that you sent me of on the left. That's who on the left?
That's James Douglas Hamilton. He's the current Baron of Selkirk.
Okay. So I did the same thing. I compared it to an image of Billy, a different one, but when Billy was older. And the older images are a little easier to do the compare because a lot of the stuff that was done as far as plastic surgery and cosmetics and all that stuff, it doesn't hold together as well.
Right.
As he got older. So more of his natural features are emerging or coming through. And so I did the same compare. And I noticed, in fact, I brought my wife in. I asked her, do these two people, she knows who Billy is, do they look similar to you? She goes, oh, absolutely.
Yes. And I'm just thinking, James' parents were married in late 37 and they had 5 boys. So I'm just thinking, well, maybe they're cousins. But then I find this young picture of James and wow, he looks just like Viv. So look at the jawline.
Yeah, that is a wow.
And I think maybe they're more than cousins. Maybe they're half brothers. Maybe Billy is Douglas Hamilton's illegitimate son.
Oh, that's crazy.
Until November, December 37. When I first saw this picture of James, I thought he looks just like Viv, but I wanted to find an image of Viv that would work. And I think I got it from a music video. Oh, and then there in the book, Billy says, I look like James. He's talking about his son, James, but maybe he's also talking about his half brother, James. He looks more like the Baron of Selkirk than he does even his own son, really.
I mean, he looks like his son. If we take a look at Vivian Stanshall, we're talking about the Stanshall folks, and I always have to say this because I always have to say it. We're talking about the version of Vivian Stanshall that played in the Bonzo Dog Band with Neil Innes. And there were at least 2 versions of Stanshall. There was the version that Billy played in the Bonzos, and there was Victor Stanshall, who Billy had on his payroll to play the Stanshall character, so that Billy could have his McCartney character and his Stanshall character coexist. The version of Stanshall that you're looking at right now is Billy from the Bonzos. Yeah,
so then I think, well, if he's Douglas Hamilton's illegitimate son, James' half-brother, let's look at Douglas Hamilton. He's one of the most fascinating characters in all of this.
So this would be his father now?
This would be who I'm thinking maybe his father.
Okay. And you say his illegitimate child. And the reason why you're saying that is because
Billy says he was born in 1937. Douglas Hamilton married in November, December 1937. And they had 5 boys. The oldest was Angus, born in 38. So if he's his son, he was an illegitimate son. I'll show later that he was illegitimate. James wrote a book about his father. He's written a couple books. And in one of James' books, it has a photograph of his parents' wedding. They're coming out of the St. Giles Cathedral. And it was November 37, James says. And anything else you see on the internet, it says they were married in December. I tend to believe James. He would know when his parents were married. So I think it was November.
Okay.
37. It was a, white wedding, a big formal affair. The premier peer of Scotland's getting married.
Okay, and you're going to show us why you believe that Billy is the illegitimate child of the Duke of Hamilton.
Of the 14th Duke of Hamilton.
Okay.
So he's interesting. He was a boxer, a champion boxer, a pilot. His three brothers were pilots. They were all in the Royal Air Force in World War II. Douglas was Commodore in the Royal Air Force, a very young Commodore. And then this story, I never knew about this from World War II, but Rudolf Hess flew to Scotland in 1941 in an effort. He wanted a message sent to Churchill. He was trying to stop the war.
Right.
It was 1941, so Douglas was the Duke at the time. He was looking for Douglas Hamilton. He wanted him to take a message. He crashed his plane. So there was a big controversy about it. Like, how did you know him? He said, I never met him personally, but he knew about him because at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, they both attended the same banquet. Hess always maintained that, no, I never met Douglas Hamilton. And for Douglas Hamilton, it was a sensitive subject. People were saying, well, you were working with him beforehand, but it never went anywhere but it's a sensitive subject to the family. They want to make sure that Douglas Hamilton is cleared of any question about knowing Rudolf Hess beforehand. All it was they attended the same very large banquet in 1936 at the Berlin Olympics. Now, his son James wrote 2 books about his father, and they're both about this incident.
The incident with Hess.
The incident with Hess.
Okay.
So the other reason Hess said he sought out Douglas Hamilton in particular was because he'd known about him. Douglas Hamilton in 1933 wanted to do an expedition over Mount Everest. So it was a famous flight. They had open cockpits, and it was a very dangerous. So he was well known for this at the time. The first thing he did, he sought funding for it, and he got that funding from a wealthy London widow, Lucy Lady Houston. She started out as a chorus girl, ended up one of the wealthiest women in London. She gave him the money. She funded this expedition, and they took 2 planes, 4 men. One of the men was a cinema photographer. He made a documentary about this expedition. It came out in 1934, and it won the Oscar in 1934 for Best Documentary, and it was called Wings Over Everest, which, of course, brings up, I saw that interview with Howard Stern, where he says we considered naming Abbey Road album Everest, which odd when you hear it at the time. Why Everest? So I don't know if that really happened or if he's just dropping a clue.
Well, and he also has his live album, Wings Over America, so maybe that's also a play on Wings Over Everest.
Yes, and the tour Wings Over the World, which got canceled in 1980 after he was arrested in Japan. So just more clues for me. They're adding up. So let's go back to Nina. Nina, to me, looks a lot like Stella. I've always thought there's something in Stella's eyes. It looks like there's something else behind them, something or someone else behind her eyes. And Nina has the same eyes, the same look in her eyes. Also, their noses are very similar, especially the tip. Maybe not so much in this photograph. We see other photographs of Nina. She looks a lot like Stella in the eyes and the nose. And I found out later Stella's middle name is Nina. Stella Nina.
Oh, okay. Very interesting.
It's interesting. So at this point, this has got to be his father. But it's still speculation, right, on my part. And I feel like I got confirmation in the music video. It was made in 1979, Wonderful Christmas Time music video. At one point, there's 4 diamonds that come out of the sky, and it's like they're in formation as if they're planes coming in for a landing into the runway. And I'm thinking, are those supposed to be, is that like Lucy's diamonds in the sky? There were 4 men on that expedition. There's 4 diamonds. As soon as they're out of sight, because they land, a white horse appears in the sky. Now, those two airplanes they took on that expedition had Pegasus engines. And Pegasus, of course, in Greek mythology is a white stallion. Later in the video, a woman in 1950s hair and dress, early 50s fashion, gets out of a car. She picks up a toy, a wind-up toy dog, and cradles it as if it's real. Of course, Nina died in 1951 and was an animal rights activist. I'm thinking, is that supposed to be symbolic of Nina? And to me, this is confirmation that he was putting out there as early as 79 that this is his family.
There are other images of Billy with a pale horse as well, not just in the video here. I've seen other images where on his farm.
Oh, yeah. I didn't think of that. And maybe there's a lot more behind the mythology of Pegasus than just the engines being Pegasus engines.
There could be, but I think that the association that you made is valid.
So for me, that's confirmation. I think this is his father. I think he's his son. A couple more things about him. He was in the 60s, he was director of Scottish aviation. I didn't know airplanes were so big in Scotland, but it's kind of a big deal, Scottish aviation. And in 1969, Scottish aviation came out with an aerobatic aircraft called the Bulldog. And you think of the song, Hey Bulldog, there's a line in it that says, jackknife in your sweaty hands. Well, jackknife was a maneuver, a really hairy maneuver that these aerobatic planes did. And of course, in the book, it says that John Lennon was sort of saying, if you're lonely, you can talk to me. The Bulldog didn't go into production until 69, but Angus Hamilton, Douglas Hamilton's son, was test piloting that thing as early as 67. So before the song came out, it was being test piloted.
Yeah, because the song was released in 1968.
So maybe Billy kind of wrote that, if you're lonely, you can talk to me, for his brother Angus. Also, in the Magical Mystery Tour, where he says, there's another disguise, I'm in another disguise in that movie. And during I Am a Walrus, there's an airplane. And I'm thinking maybe he's in that airplane. I think that's the disguise. It was during I Am a Walrus. And during that song, during the music video too, there's an airplane flying around in the sky. The whole family, they were pilots. And it's possible for someone to get, in the United States, it's possible for someone who's blind in one eye to get a pilot's license. You can't be a commercial pilot, but you can get a pilot's license. And all of those boys in that family, they're all pilots.
You know, another airplane connection, Stacy, and it's mentioned in the book, in the footnotes. I think it's the footnotes, where he claims that he was in an airplane on a tarmac on 9/11/2001.
Yes. And so was Leonard Cohen, or he was there.
Yeah. So I'm just saying it's another airplane connection.
Yeah. Another thing about Douglas, his brother, who was the Baron of Selkirk of his day, his name was George. And George was intelligence for Royal Air Force during World War II. And remember in the book, it says, Billy says it was his uncle that called George Martin to say, it's my nephew that's going to play this role on a permanent basis. So if he was intelligence in World War II, he definitely outranked George Martin. So maybe it was Uncle George that made that phone call.
So his uncle is the brother of Douglas Hamilton, and his father has a brother named George, and that would be Billy's uncle. And Uncle George called George Martin and said, hey, my nephew is going to be the guy that's going to fill the role.
Yes. And so this is the 14th Duke of Hamilton. Remember, that family has many, many titles. Well, they always give the title Baron of Selkirk not to the Duke, but they give it to another son. So in his day, Uncle George was the Baron of Selkirk, and James is the current Baron of Selkirk. So I'm satisfied at this point that that's his father. But I'm reading that line on page 20. My mother, called Mary here, like Paul's, died when I was young. So I think, well, we're never going to know who the mother is. It's not going to be possible, but I can't help but still continue to look around the family. And I see that Douglas Hamilton's wife was Elizabeth Percy. And that reminds me of Percy Thrillington. And I think, well, okay, is this a stab at his stepmother? Maybe she didn't want her husband's illegitimate son around her 5 boys, and Billy felt set aside, sort of sacrificed. Maybe this is kind of a stab at her.
When did his father pass away?
1973.
Okay. So he was around for a pretty long time.
Yeah, he was around to see what happened with the Beatles.
Yep. Right into the Wings period.
Right into the Wings period. So I can't help. I just go deeper into this Elizabeth, because her maiden name was Percy. Is another clue to me. Also, Elizabeth's mother's name was Helen, and he does say in the Sir William chapter that his grandmother's name was Helen. He said she was the one that entered his name in the family Bible when he was born.
Well, he has the song Helen Wheels as well.
And Helen Wheels. Was she Hell on Wheels? I think maybe she was. So Elizabeth, she was the daughter of the 8th Duke of Northumberland, and her mother was Helen, who was the daughter of the Duke of Richmond, which when a daughter of a duke marries a duke or an heir to a duke, it's called a ducal marriage. There's only 24 non-royal dukedoms in the UK, so it's sort of a rare thing to have a ducal marriage. Of course, Elizabeth had a ducal marriage too, because she was the daughter of a duke and married the heir to a duke. So this is a powerful line.
Well, that's what I was just going to say. So he comes from an aristocratic bloodline.
They are serious blue bloods. So this Percy line, the Dukes of Northumberland, the Percys, it's known as a female line because remember in the Douglas side, there were only 2 times, the Douglas Hamilton side, there were only 2 times where the only heir was a daughter. And we saw what happened both times. One time they hyphenated the name with the Douglases, and the second time he gave the title to his 4th cousin. But apparently it happened so many times on the Percy side that it's now known as a female line. Every time an heir daughter married, the husband took the Percy name. So they never hyphenated it, but it is known as a female line. Going back through that, I found this Henry Percy, the 9th Earl of Northumberland, and it got my attention because his nickname was the Wizard Earl. He was known as the Wizard Earl because he had a large library and because he was patron to many, many scientists. That included a Thomas Harriot, who was said to have invented binary notation and arithmetic.
Okay, hold on a second.
Yeah.
Say that again.
Okay, Thomas Harriot was said to have invented binary notation and arithmetic. So I'm thinking, okay, Henry Percy's encoder was named Thomas Harriot.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Gets your attention.
It sure does. And I'm reading here on the bottom right, the Wizard Earl. It says, from his scientific and alchemical experiments.
Yes. So, of course, following back, it gets old. You can't follow the line back. I just ended up jumping right to who founded the House of Percy. I just went to write who founded it. And it was this William de Percy. Now, he arrived in England the year after the Norman invasion. So 1067, he arrives in England and becomes a feudal land baron. 1067, 900 years before Sergeant Pepper. And that brings up the line, it's the only whisper message it's written backwards. And it says, Monsieur, how about another one? That makes me think of the cover of Abbey Road. The license plate on that Volkswagen Beetle says LMW 28 if. Maybe it means Le Monsieur William. 2 + 8 is 10. I is the 9th letter. F is the 6th letter. 1096. William de Percy died in 1096. Now, when I first saw this, it gave a death date of 1096. Now you can see someone added a 9.
Yeah.
But it wasn't that way when I first found it. How odd for someone to add a 9. I mean,
well, especially for this entry, because how many people are looking up William de Percy?
Yeah, and who's going to mix up a 6 with a 9? Well, we're reading these old documents, and we don't know if this is a 6 or a 9.
So you think the license plate on the Volkswagen on the cover of Abbey Road is a clue to William de Percy's death, the year of his death?
Yes, and that message says backwards, it says, Monsieur, Monsieur, how about another one? And of course, when he arrived in England, it was exactly 900 years before Sgt. Pepper came out.
So how about another one? Connect that dot for me, meaning what?
Another William. Here's another William. I don't know. Does he think he's reincarnated from William de Percy? How about another William anyway? 900 years later.
So right now what we have, Stacy, just so I can collect my own thoughts, we have 2 lines coming together, 2 lines of ancestry, family tree, whatever you want to refer to it as. We have the Hamiltons and we have Percy.
Yes, the Douglas Hamiltons and Percy.
Douglas Hamiltons, right. And Percy.
And Percy. 2 very powerful lines, each in their own right. Ancient lines. And the Douglas is going back to the 1200s. And the Percy's going back almost 1,000 years. So now I think maybe this isn't his stepmother. This might be his mother. But it's all still speculation. Back to that line. My mother called Mary here like Paul's died when I was young. Maybe we should read it as my mother called Mary here for the purposes of this book. Like Paul's died when I was young for the purposes of this book. Because Elizabeth didn't die until 2008.
So, okay, so explain that some more to me because I don't think I'm getting it.
Well, that line on page 20 where he says, my mother called Mary here like Paul's died when I was young. It makes you just think, well, we're never going to know who she is.
I see.
With all of this, all of these clues, I'm starting to read it like this. My mother called Mary here for the purposes of this book. Like Paul's died when I was young for the purposes of this book. I think it's to get you sidetracked from just accept that she's gone and we'll never know her. But now I think this is her. Here's a picture, young picture of Elizabeth and Mary. Now they have different coloring. Elizabeth was very, very blonde as Linda. Blonde eyelashes, eyebrows, very blonde.
This is Elizabeth Percy?
This is Elizabeth Percy when she was very young. And Mary, Billy's daughter Mary, and there's something about the look in the eyes, maybe the mouth. I don't know. Of course, she didn't die till 2008. So there's Elizabeth as an old woman. I mean, look at the eyelids, the mouth, and the jowls. I think this is his mother. She married Douglas Hamilton in November of 37, and they had 5 boys together.
Okay, so if Billy's illegitimate, why would he look like her?
I'm saying they had Billy and in 37, and then they married in late 37.
Got it. So she had Billy before they married.
And they had 5 boys. And now that's not his stepmother.
Okay, I went down a different path. I was thinking that his father had a paramour.
Yeah, I thought that for a long time too.
But you're saying no, it's very possible that his mom is his father's wife, but they had the baby before they got married, out of wedlock.
Yeah, so he could never get the title. Today he would be the 15th Duke of Hamilton, but his parents weren't married the day he was born. All they had to do was be married the day he was born, and he'd be the premier peer of Scotland today. Curious that they didn't get married. So for confirmation, again, another music video. This one made in 1980, Waterfalls. I've watched that video many times. When you watch it, you just know there's a lot going on in that thing that you don't understand.
Yeah, I watched it too.
Yeah, a lot of symbolism. And I'm watching that thing, and, it's a very sad song with this oddly comical. The video has this oddly comical ending. After the music is over, he turns out the light, and you hear garbage cans crashing, and then a cuckoo clock. And it seems out of place because the song is so sad. And why is this comical ending? Well, then I started to wonder about the cuckoo birds. I looked up cuckoo birds to find out more about them. There's a species of cuckoo bird called a brood parasite, and they lay their eggs in the nests of other species for them to raise. So, very tragic ending, given what happened to him. Then I'm watching it again, and I see this part where he closes the window. Her name was Elizabeth Ivy Percy, and that window surrounded by ivy. And I'm looking at the window. There's such a thing as Edwardian fashion and Victorian architecture. Is this an Elizabethan window? In Elizabeth I time period, timber frame window? I looked it up. It is. What makes that an Elizabethan window is the grate in the glass. Elizabeth Ivy, that's his mother. And when you think about that, Christmas Time came out in 1979. He was arrested in Japan in 1980 and came out with this music video in 1980. I think he was going through a lot in 79, 80, taking the risk in Japan. And he says he doesn't know why he took all that marijuana into Japan. It didn't make sense to him, but maybe he was just going through a lot.
Yeah, he was having a moment.
Yeah.
Well,
you'd think I'd be satisfied with all of this, right? But what drove me crazy is why would an alpha male like Douglas Hamilton, who was 34 years old, had a pregnant 21-year-old girlfriend, why would he not just marry her to make sure his son, if it was a boy, got the title? Why would he do that? And I found that in May of 1937, Elizabeth is second from the left. She was in the Coronation as a maid of honor in the Coronation in May of 1937. On the right is Helen. She was the Queen Mother's mistress of the robes until Helen died in 1967. That means she was in charge of wardrobe and jewelry for the Queen Mother. So maybe what happened is Helen really wanted her daughter to be in that coronation. Well, you can't be a married woman and be a maid of honor. You have to be a maiden. And maybe that's why they didn't get married. And also, for people that are in their circle, but not in their inner circle, it's the perfect excuse to explain why you didn't get married. They could say, well, Helen, she was determined that her daughter's in that coronation. So what were we to do? We just didn't get married until late 1937. So our firstborn son is illegitimate. He could never get the title.
Interesting. So to make sure I understand these images here. So the second to the left, on the left-hand side, that image, that is who?
That is Elizabeth Ivy Percy Douglas Hamilton.
That would be Billy's mom.
Billy's mom. Of course, at the time, she was Elizabeth Ivy Percy. She hadn't married yet. And that's the coronation in May of 1937.
And on the right is
Helen, Elizabeth's mother. She was mistress of the robes to the Queen Mother. So she was in charge of wardrobe and jewelry. So maybe she just really wanted her daughter to wear a dress that day. She really wanted her daughter to be in that coronation.
The reason why I got a little confused is because the image on the right is in color.
Yeah, it was colorized later. There's a black and white. The original is black and white, but I liked this colorized because you can see more detail.
Okay. That's why I got thrown a little bit.
Yeah, she was a beautiful young woman, Helen. She didn't maintain her beauty, but she was a beautiful young woman. And I think that's where Billy got his height and his long legs. She's a very tall woman. I mean, look at the distance between her hips and her knees. She was long-legged. And then there's that necklace. It's an 8-spoked wheel, like a Yule wheel. That's a pagan necklace. And it makes me think of how he said Helen was the one that entered his name in the family Bible. Well, now I wonder what kind of Bible. Certainly not a King James version. And when it says, I was the son of the magician, maybe it's the maternal line, like the Percy line is a female line. Maybe Helen's the magician. I don't know. Also, Helen, she was the daughter of the Duke of Richmond. The Duke of Richmond family seat is called Goodwood House. It makes you think of Norwegian wood, where the line goes, isn't it good, Norwegian wood? Now I wonder if that song has anything to do with Helen or something that happened to Goodwood House, but that's neither here nor there.
Going back to Son of the Magician, just to mention it, another indicator that Crowley is not his father came from another researcher, Wendy, who's been on some of the roundtables. Billy has this whole role where he claims in the book that he's playing the role of Horus, the Egyptian god Horus. And of course, his mother as Horus would be Isis, and Isis was known as a great magician. So he would be the son, because if he's Horus, of the magician, because Isis would be his mother. So I just want to point that out as well. That's another indicator, another clue that Crowley is not his dad.
Yes, I didn't know that. That's interesting. I don't know if you ever noticed, but sometimes in Viv's music videos, he'll sort of crinkle his nose and smile with his top and bottom teeth, kind of in a jokey smile. And there's Helen on the left making the same face. They look a lot alike. I think
they do look a lot alike. Even the nose looks alike. I mean, she's got a bigger nose, but the shape is very similar.
Yeah, he looks like Helen. Now, there's only one picture I can find of this family. It's Douglas, Elizabeth, and their 5 boys on the left. The young boys are wearing those Scottish knit sweaters. And then, of course, in Waterfalls, Billy, who's trying to look sort of like a young boy, he's wearing a knit sweater vest. Wonderful Christmas Time was made in 1979. Waterfalls was made in 1980. He looks younger in Waterfalls. It's almost like he was trying to look like a early 50s teenager.
The thing I noticed about with Waterfalls also, Stacy, is his hair is parted on the right side of his head, where normally it would be on the left side. And I think you're right as far as trying to look younger, because one of the things I noticed in that video is his skin, his facial skin looks very, very smooth, which leads me to believe that there was a lot of cosmetics, perhaps latex, that was applied to give him a very, very young look. Those were my thoughts when I watched the video, because he looks very young there.
He does. He really looks like he's trying to look like a teenager in the clothes. I mean, those pants, there's no belt loops, like pants you'd put on a young boy.
His dad doesn't look very tall to me.
No, his dad wasn't tall, and he was short-legged, and his mother was tiny too. I think he got his height from Helen and his long legs from Helen.
So from his grandmother.
From his grandmother, for Elizabeth's mother. She's a very tall woman. And now I'm thinking, because this photograph, it's not a professional photograph. They would put out a more formal pose. I wonder if young Billy took this photograph. I don't know. And it's interesting, it's the only one you can find of the whole family. Well, who put it online? Maybe it's Billy's picture. Maybe he put it online. I don't know.
Yeah.
So we've talked about this before. 4 to 9. There's 4 letters in Paul. There's 9 letters in McCartney. Well, William Macmillan, there are 15 letters. In Douglas Hamilton, there are 15 letters. Also, in the late 50s, early 60s, there was a Prime Minister of the UK. He was a Scot named Harold Macmillan, and his nickname was Super Mac. So maybe this means William Super Mac. Also, Billy's 4th classical album was called Ecce Cor Meum, Behold My Heart. And this is on the left is the program for that, for one of the performances. And you can see M.C.C. for McCartney. You can also see M.E. for me. Flip it upside down, and you can see a W for William, an A, I think, for Alfred after his paternal grandfather, D for Douglas, an H for Hamilton, and then a lowercase p for Paul. So I think his birth name, illegitimate or not, I think his birth name might be Lord William, Alfred, Douglas, Hamilton. Now, Elizabeth and Douglas married in late 37. Their firstborn son was Angus, and his middle name is Allen, which is Elizabeth's father's name. Oh, and then there's this. So 1 dot on the side for Billy, 5 on the top, maybe for his 5 Douglas Hamilton brothers, 3 on the side for the other 3 Beatles. And that, Mike, is that.
Very good, Stacy. Seriously. So just to recap, Billy's father is Douglas Hamilton. His mother, Elizabeth Ivy Percy. His grandmother was Helen Percy.
Helen Gordon Lennox Percy. She was the daughter of the Duke of Richmond.
Okay, so his grandmother was Helen Gordon Lennox Percy. And Billy's birth name again, what do you believe it is?
Billy's birth name is Lord William Alfred Douglas Hamilton. He's illegitimate, so he can't get the title, but he still was born a lord. But
wow, this is crazy. You know why this is so crazy? It's because these are names that nobody's talking about that I know of. And it takes a little time to get your head around his family tree. When did his grandmother pass away?
Helen?
Yeah.
1965.
Okay, so in the book, he says that there was a woman that was his advocate.
A woman of renown.
A woman of renown. That's right.
I think I know who that is.
I thought maybe it was his grandmother, but you think it's somebody else?
Yes. I think it's Diana's grandmother, Lady Ruth Fermoy, who was a renowned pianist in her day, and she was the one that identified him as a prodigy. Remember, it says that in the book. The woman of renown is the one that identified him as a music prodigy. Well, in Rocky Raccoon, it says she and her man, who called himself Dan, Lady Ruth Fermoy, she became a lady when she married Maurice Fermoy. I think his name was Maurice. He was a peer in Ireland, in the peerage of Ireland. He was a peer. So she and her man, who called himself Dan, he's a Danny boy. Her name was McGill. Ruth's maiden name is Gill. She called herself Lil. Ruth's mother's maiden name was Little John, but everyone knew her as Nancy. And Nancy means grace. And they would call those people that outranked them, yes, your grace, no, your grace. They would address them that way. So I think it was Lady Ruth Fermoy that's the woman of renown. And maybe you'll find this interesting. Through his grandmother Helen, the Richmond side, he's like something like 5th cousins with Lady Diana.
So before we head out, Stacy, I just want to say that you did a fantastic job with the research. I find it to be very compelling, and I think it's possible that you may have broken the code as to who are Billy's parents. So Stacy, again, thank you so much. I am very happy that you reached out to me. I'm glad that we finally got to cover this topic. I know it's going to be of keen interest to the audience, and you have an open invite to come back at any time. It was a great presentation. So thank you very much, Stacy, and I'm sure we will talk soon.
Thank you, Mike.